station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week on the Cities podcast, I'm continuing our journey to understand the city of Havana in 20 items. Now, we're up to episode 8, which means I only have 6 items left. And we left off with Fidel Castro coming into Havana and proclaiming this new Republic of Cuba that was not going to be the same. It was not going to have U.S. economic influence. So it's going to be quite a challenge to take us from 1959, 1960, all the way to 2017. And I only have 6 items to do it. A lot has happened in the last 70 years, and what I'm going to explain is just some of the most important things. A challenge you face when you study cities is really bringing out the most important thing about the city and not necessarily the nation. This is especially difficult when you're looking at cities like Havana, which are clearly the central and most economically, culturally important of the nation. So I'm going to try to keep it Havana-centric, and I'm going to try to bring this all together with 6 more items. This week's items are the poster and the textbook. A poster will represent, as you come to see, this new regime led by Fidel Castro that is seeking to turn Havana upside down. And the book, the textbook, or it can be even a workbook or any sort of school book that might teach is based on one of the most successful campaigns that starts from Havana and goes out into Cuba. But it has important ramifications for the sort of way we're going to view Havana as a city in Cuba in the coming weeks. So, just to recap, last week we talked about the dollar and the beard. U.S. influence was fought out by these revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro, Camilo Cienfuegos, Che Guevara, and a new regime comes into power. In 1960, in July of 1960, shortly after this regime change occurs, the Cuban government nationalizes all U.S. businesses without compensation. And we're talking about an enormous part of the economy. Land ownership, both inside and outside of Havana, was absolutely U.S. dominated. And the Cuban government nationalized it all. No compensation, took it and said, this is part of Cuba, this is ours. As you might expect, the United States didn't like that. So they begin to roll out trade embargoes right away. They begin to take 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children are brought to the United States in an operation called Pedro Pan. In 1961, the U.S. breaks off diplomatic relations with Cuba, and in April is the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which over 1,000 exiles who had been trained in the United States, backed by the CIA, attempt an invasion and attempt to retake Cuba. That fails 1961, and Fidel Castro shortly after, in May, declares Cuba a socialist state. So Cuba allies with the Soviet Union, and that's going to change Havana later on as we go. But even with this embargo going on, one of the first things that Fidel Castro wanted to do, and one of the biggest challenges he faced when he took over Cuba, was the enormous amount of illiteracy. So although Havana had a great system of casinos, hotels, and places to party for middle-class Americans, there were quite a few Cubans who didn't even know how to read. So this becomes one of the first things that Castro attempts to do. And the reason I choose the textbook is because the movement sort of starts in Havana. Even though Castro announces his plans in New York City, in fact, at the United Nations, illiteracy rate throughout Cuba is about 23%. So only about 50% of Cubans actually go to school, and nearly a quarter of them aren't able to read Spanish. So one of the switches that happens, and this switch especially happens in Havana, is sort of a peasantization of the city. The farmers are invited in, so it's like open your house to a campesino, open your home to a farmer. Big celebrations for farmers are taking place in Havana, and at the same time, those in Havana who are most often the better off, the ones with the education, the ones that are financially doing at least well, they're asked to begin to sacrifice for the revolution. So in 1961, Fidel says that 1961 is going to be this year of education, and we're going to get rid of illiteracy. This is Fidel's goal, and he asks for volunteers. So hundreds of thousands of volunteers from all over Cuba, but mostly from Havana as well, join. So these are children ages 15 to 20 asked to volunteer for the revolution. Over 100,000 join. They get a pair of boots, a bell, a beret, a backpack, a hammock, and a teacher's manual. And they're sent out. So they're sent out to go abroad. Within Cuba. They're sent to go to the hills, Sierra Maestra mountains. They're to find anyone who can't read and to teach them. And what it does is within a year, Cuba only has about 3%. Fidel says that illiteracy is wiped out entirely, and it's certainly close enough to doing that, which is just a sort of extraordinary thing. So by the end of the campaign, by the end of 1961, nearly 1 million Cubans had learned to read and write, and the levels of illiteracy were reduced to almost nothing. In fact, the ones who remained illiterate were people who were physically and mentally disabled, or immigrants from, say, Haiti, who were viewed in different ways. But that's a different sort of conversation. For now, we know on December 22nd, Castro, 1 year after his revolution, says no time is more solemn and moving, no instant more joyous, no minute filled with more genuine pride and glory than this one, in which 4.5 centuries of ignorance has been demolished. So this is sort of one of the biggest rallying points of the Cuban Revolution. It's something that is referred to on and on throughout, that these young youths put to work, volunteers go out from the city, they go out into the rural areas, and they spread literacy. The program that's developed it from Yo Si Puedo, Yes I Can, is expanded and sent out in sort of this internationalist movement. It goes, to Africa, to Latin America. So this is a huge sort of thing that comes out of Havana and out of this new revolutionary movement. Now, the other item I've chosen this week is the poster, because of the way ideology changes. And, I explained Castro declares Cuba a socialist state in 1961, and that's the same year that the embargo happens. So right away, there's a huge switch, especially in the city, that was, injected by American tourists and invigorated by this American economy. It now has to switch, and it switches 180 degrees. Now that it's a socialist state, it's going to be allied with the Soviet Union. This leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The closest maybe the Cold War comes to ending the world as we know it. And basically, relations are cut off with the United States. Flights are suspended between Havana and Miami, and we have a few big boat lift experiments. Now, I'm trying my best not to get away from Havana as a city and get too far into the Cuba conversation. What this means for Havana is that it becomes sort of an ideological battleground, because a lot of people in Havana had done well from privatized businesses and had done well from businesses that sort of survived based on the U.S. investment in Havana. Now that the system's different and that people are getting free land out in rural areas, Havana's just not that impressive. So a lot of peasants come to Havana. It becomes a lot less educated, a lot less wealthy. People who had private jobs are they're basically assigned new jobs that are more beneficial to the revolution. So people are actually in a lot of ways encouraged to leave. So if you come initially to Havana thinking, okay, I'm with the revolution, well, the revolution is happening elsewhere. The revolution is happening in the farms and so on and so forth. So Havana really changes as a sort of focus city. This peasantization, or the same sort of thing that happens in the Soviet Union, really decentralizes the city because of the focus it puts on the rural areas. Now, this is not always the case for Havana, and certainly people move into these mansions that were vacated by Cubans fleeing this new regime. So there's a lot of just a total switch in population, and those that come to Havana are in support of this revolution. Obviously, those who leave are not in favor of it. So these posters sort of reaffirm this revolution is going to take place, and these are our new beliefs. The posters that depict the Cuban peasant sort of stopping Uncle Sam from entering into Cuban affairs. These kind of things become the wallpaper of the revolution and the wallpaper of Havana. So if you can imagine this sort of thing, and a lot of fantastic art is done through these posters, but what it does is it changes the ideology, or at least aims to change the ideology of the habanero. And as we go forth, we will have 2 more weeks after this, 4 more items. We're going to trace how effective this ideological change was. Thanks again for joining me on Hour of History. This is the Cities series. We're almost to the end. We're almost to modern day Havana. Please do remember to leave feedback, retweet, and subscribe. Thanks for listening.